Hello and welcome to Depth Insights, where we take a depth psychological look at news, topics, and events that are going on in your world today. I'm your host, Bonnie Bright, and I'm also the founder of Depth Psychology Alliance, which is an online academic community for everyone who's interested in the field of Jungian and depth psychology. And you can find Depth Psychology Alliance at www.depthpsychologyalliance.com. It's a growing, dynamic community with people from different walks of life who are all deeply drawn by the practice and the field of depth psychology. And one of the exciting things that we have going on is the online book club. And this is an opportunity where we have a different author come on every month and talk about a book that they wrote. Everything is done in writing as an open forum, and the author introduces what they want to talk about. They talk about themes in the book. They share some of the experience of writing the book, and then everyone who's a member of the book club, which is free, can comment, ask questions, and interact with the author over the course of the month as they go through the assigned readings. And it's been a wonderful program so far, and so I invite everybody to come check that out. And I'm very excited for my guest today because Ken Kimmel is the author for the April online book club. Ken is a Jungian psychoanalyst in Seattle with over 30 years of clinical practice. And he's also an alum of Sonoma State College and a graduate of North Pacific Institute for Analytical Psychology. And Ken's current interests concern the interface of analytical psychology with contemporary psychoanalysis, phenomenology, and mystical traditions. And this is, for me, such a tremendous descriptor of what I perceive depth psychology to be about. So I'm very glad to have Ken here with me today. Welcome to the show, Ken. Thanks for being here.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Well, I'm glad to have you because your book is going to be something quite different than anything that we've done so far this year in the online book club. You've written a book called Eros and the Shattering Gaze, Transcending Narcissism. And it just seems like narcissism is such a huge piece of our culture these days. And I don't know if it's changed over the course of time, but I suspect that the way that our culture has developed has something to do with that. And so it's really interesting to be able to bring it to the forefront and really shine a light onto something that is probably frequently in the shadow of our culture. Can you just talk to us about what prompted you to explore this area of the psyche? And, you know, within that, why is the understanding of narcissism and its harmful impact, as you suggest, on our capacity to love so important at this time and this place in our culture?
Well, that's really big questions, and we have to look at it from both a personal basis, historical, cultural basis as well, and because it is pervasive. If we look back at all the myths, whether it's Narcissus and Echo or it's Psyche and Eros who takes the maiden Psyche and kind of appropriates her and uses her for his partner, and she lives in the dark and he kind of gets his way. So culturally, we find it in such things as the national wounding from 9/11, whereby our wound was so immense, our vulnerability was so exposed that we quickly had to cover our woundedness up and create narcissistic defenses, if you will. Donald Kalsha described it as a rupturing of the security membrane of our society. And we created this war on terror and the homeland security, and where freedom, expression, creativity became kind of repressed in our society in favor of the need for security, control, and the obliteration of vulnerability. And so we find that kind of destructive narcissism, if you will, that sort of shuts off any chance that we might be harmed again through retaliation. We retaliate, we set up 2 wars soon after the attacks, and we're still trying to kind of bring ourselves out of those. But that's like an example of how narcissism culturally can impact us in the United States in particular. I mean, you find it in various types of relationships as well, where rather noted relationships where particularly nowadays celebrities and politicians being caught very usury kinds of behaviors that are also aspects of narcissistic behavior, just so rampant. So those are aspects on the collective level, but on the more personal level, we find narcissism to be so so pervasive precisely because, as you said earlier in your questioning, it's hidden. When you're working with psychosis or borderline people, bipolar, I mean, they're right out there. Their pathology, so to speak, their symptoms are not hidden. It's not so with narcissism. You can have CEOs, senators, gurus, ladies' men. Their illness is disguised, and their internal predator, if you will, lies hidden. Yet it exerts an enormous amount of power over the ego. So the second part of the question is, how does this impact the capacity to love, and why is it so important? Well, it really is about the way we overcome narcissism is placed in the other before the self.
Right. So what I get from what you're saying and from the book itself, actually, there's a pretty natural progression here, which is done really well. But for the benefit of those who have not yet read Eros and the Shattering Gaze, what I see is there are levels of this condition in which people not only are, I don't know if I want to say engaging with it or it's engaging them perhaps is maybe even a better way to look at it, but they're in the grips of narcissistic disorder, first maybe on a level to actually be able to protect themselves or defend against something. And as you move along that spectrum, it becomes probably even more pathological and literally gets in the way of people being able to act normally, whatever that is, and to create problems for people that do prevent them from being able to love and be loved on the level that we really require as human beings in order to function in our culture and in our lives.
Yes, it's exposing the vulnerability, our capacity for intimacy, allowing the other in and access to our own inner states of mind. I like to think of narcissism as kind of currents within us. You know, there's parts of us that can kind of get possessed by narcissistic states. So we may not be necessarily a diagnosable narcissistic character disordered person, but we all have different components of narcissism in us that I think that we all carry from the very beginning. I think more contemporary theory tends to believe that narcissism is the first defense. You know, mother leaves the infant and the infant experiences being dropped or the lack of containment or what have you, and narcissistic defenses are set up as a way of trying to encase the infant in some sort of self-protection. You know, the story of Narcissus and Echo is a good one because on the one hand, Narcissus at birth, his mother takes him to Tiresias, the blind soothsayer, who tells his mother, you know, your son will live to a ripe old age so long as he not know himself. So what that suggests is the narcissistic person is afraid of the inner depths, is afraid of allowing the truth or the pain of life or the experience to impact them from the inside to come to the surface, whereas when Echo is pursuing him, all she can do is echo back what he says. He says, I'd rather die than give you power over me. And so all she could say is, I give you power over me. So every Narcissus has an Echo, has a kind of a narcissistic object that is engaged with. And so he lives life at the surface where he can't allow anyone in and he can't allow the energies, the internal objects, if you will, to come to the surface in consciousness because he can't know himself. So he just has to look at the surface of life.
Yeah, that's really powerful. I've always really loved that myth, and I think that the message that's in it for all of us is just so profound. You know, when you start to look at yourself, when you become self-reflective, and many of us make this transition, if we have not already, at least kind of by middle age, once we start looking at, once we've completed a lot of the other tasks in life and sort of established a career and family and gone through those things in our 20s and 30s. And of course, as we hit what Jung often referred to as the second half of life, somewhere probably late 30s or early 40s, we really start more of that self-reflective kind of effort. And I know it kind of, I mean, for a lot of people it's scary to think about looking at themselves and to actually reflect on what they've come to, if you want to look at it that way. And I know John Beebe, who wrote a blurb for your book, expressed that in his own testimonial. He said, this is the book for those who fear that Jungian efforts to gaze deeply into the self are carrying coals to the Newcastle of narcissistic personality disorder. He goes on to say, Ken Kimmel certainly shows us the egoistic pitfalls that can attend such an enterprise, but he also makes us see why he believes that inner work really does hold the power to shake the foundations of someone's ability to see the face of the other. And I just thought that was such a well-articulated statement, because as we dig into depth psychology, and of course Jungian psychology is a big part of that, and start to work with our dreams, start to look at what the things are that drive us, it begins to be a journey. You know, it's perilous. It's fraught with peril. We could certainly go either way, and if we allow the narcissism to take over, it's going to be a very different outcome than if we're actually open and willing to allow ourselves to be vulnerable in that way. Ken, you talk about the men's split feminine.
Yes.
And, of course, the way in which our culture has developed over a long time has become so separated into what we often call the masculine and the feminine. Can you describe to us how male psyches, in your view, can become so negatively impacted by this split between the masculine and the feminine? And equally damaging is the effect that it has on women that the men are involved with.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point to talk about. You know, whenever we speak about splitting, we're talking about division, amnesia barriers, being cut off, a lack of cohesiveness in the psyche, which is what, you know, we like to describe wholeness or the coming to wholeness or integration, those sorts of words. I like the notion of cohesiveness, because it's all these disparate parts that we're trying to find some way of finding peace and, you know, acknowledging the dark and the light in the psyche. But when a man is split, he literally lives only part of a life. And what happens in the process of the split feminine, which is a term that Peter Mudd coined in a wonderful paper he wrote for Roundtable Review many moons ago. But when a man is split through the maternal or through the feminine, he cannot hold the multidimensionality of a woman in the world, nor the feminine aspects, if you will, within himself. He has to split them in two, in a sense, where he may find a woman in his life who's the stable, strong, secure, sensation function type, kind of an Emma Jung, for instance, that Jung had. And then he has to kind of colonize that relationship, you know, force that person into a rather fixed form of relating, because he needs that person to perform a particular function for him. He appropriates that woman. And then in turn, because he gets bored so quick, or there's no life because he's kind of making the world dead around him because of his need for control, he looks for this enticing, desirable woman, the Sabina Spielrein or the Toni Wolff or the femme inspiratrice kind of image, for instance. And I'm just giving Jung as an example, but you know, there are many, many examples. I talk about Clinton and his experiences, and there are many others. I use those examples because it is so very, very common in society. So the woman who becomes the inspiration or the sexual object or the mysterious or the desirable one inspires him, inflames his desires, so he's able to live out that aliveness through this other woman, and until it runs its course or she starts demanding more than he wants to give, or whatever the reasons might be, where he flees back to the safe arms of the maternal mother, wife, so to speak, and does damage to everyone around the relationship, whether it's the other woman or it's the wife or it's the children, or to himself ultimately, because he's experiencing a split that probably originates through some kind of, oftentimes you'll find trauma in the history, whereas the mother may have spent time in the hospital, or there was a long period of loss of the maternal container, some sort of thing, or the mother's cold and depressed and withdrawn or what have you, and so the infant usually finds some kind of image. Maybe it's a maid. In Jung's case, he had a very special dark-skinned maid that he described in Memories, Dreams, Reflections that kind of provided he felt loved, whereas he felt suspicious of his mother because she was not, stable for him in any type of ongoing way. And so this kind of creates a split in him where he seeks the stability, but then it's deadening and he looks for someone to enliven him. But the painful truth is he's appropriating these people, fixing them into these relationships where there's no life, there's no vitality for either one, because they can't be, multiple dimensioned women who can be many things. I mean, that's the real charge for men who work with me. They often have a wife at home and they're trying to find a way to bring the multidimensional aspects of their relationship to their inner feminine as well as the woman in their lives into the world, learning to do that. And it's not an easy process because it has to deal with that ultimate deep loss.
Yeah, I really like how you described it, and it's very interesting that you take Jung as an example. I think that's very compelling because, of course, a lot of us in this field tend to idealize Jung on some level, and even though we know that he was very human and had his own foibles, this is really what you're talking about. This narcissism is really a pattern that seems to be enacted over and over and over again. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Michael Conforti's work. He's a Jungian analyst on the East Coast, and he's currently hosting the March online book club.
Yes, I know.
I'm sure you're aware. And he talks a lot about this idea of archetypes or fields that just express themselves over and over and over again. And, until we figure out what the field is that has us in its grip and how to actually make some kind of a change to that field in order to move ourselves out of it, it's never going to change.
Yes.
So I think narcissism in that way is such a powerful arbiter of anyone who happens to be caught in this particular arena. And I can only imagine that it takes time to figure out how to get out of that. But do you actually see some results? Do you see that people are able to make that change and to move out of it with deep work on themselves?
Well, absolutely. And the truth is it's very, very difficult for men, and I work primarily with men with this problem, but to have men that will actually have the courage to really look at their own vulnerability. And often the way through and the way into finding ways of transcending narcissism is through their awareness of shame and being able to contain and bear and tolerate the awareness. And we talk about the shattering gaze of the other. It's really the other with a big O, the beloved, the being able to see into this person, and that gaze that can shatter the narcissistic defenses. And when a man realizes, oh my God, what have I done? How have I injured my family through my behavior, through my coldness, through my dominance, through my multiple womanizing throughout our marriage, whatever it might be, through, men's various forms of brutality, and to actually be able to recognize that level of pain that we cause to the other that we're supposed to care about and love, and it can actually bring a man to his knees and bring something new emerging from out of that pain. He's flooded with dreams and emotional life. He becomes aware of this kind of inner saboteur, or it's almost like an inner guru that can be spellbinding over the ego, that can kind of entice him into believing that what he's doing is, I'm just taking care of myself, or I'm just taking care of my need, or he has to withdraw, or he has to have control over everything. But to become aware that there is this internal voice that can really convince a man that what he's doing is completely justifiable, to actually begin to get at that kind of destructive narcissism in a man is not an easy or slow task. It's really a grain of sand by grain of sand process. It's like the old Bruce Springsteen song, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, over years and months and years. And it's not for the faint of heart. I think men really have to. Often the shattering can come in the way of a tragedy or a loss or misfortune. Von Franz talks about that, how we have to confront the elements of the shadow. The shadow often presents the ego with these kinds of situations where we're brought to our knees, so to speak, but in so doing, the shadow contents begin to be integrated, and that, of course, is the shadow is really the messenger of the self in many ways. So we have to kind of undergo that level of decentering of the ego and its controls, connecting it from this terrible kind of inner saboteur, inner assassin, if you will. And that's the more destructive level of narcissism. It's different from the defensive levels of narcissism, which has more to do with not so much destroying links to relationships, but needing to colonize relationships, needing the other to be the same as you, that there can't be any kind of separation between you and the other. You have to colonize or be colonized by. That's more the defensive layer of narcissism.
Well, you know, Ken, I'm really struck by the word shatter, which is in the title of your book, of course, Eros and the Shattering Gaze, Transcending Narcissism. And I think what you've just been talking about, this idea of being able to transcend narcissism, is quite profound and not at all easy. In fact, the way that you have described it as grain of sand by grain of sand is a very, very poignant image for me that comes up. And when I hear you talk about that, it actually gives me a great deal of empathy for people that are really struggling with this particular disorder. And, you know, I took the liberty of looking up the etymology of the word shatter, and it's related closely to the word scatter. And so that brings me back to this whole idea of the grains of sand and how when something is shattered, it can be blown into so many millions of tiny little bits that it's hard to imagine how it can ever come back together again. It's a very poignant word and an image, and I think that what you have grasped by going into this body of work and doing the research that you've done on it is something that can really be transformational for so many of us. And Mario Jacobi, who, of course, was a Jungian analyst out of Zurich and was lost to the community several months ago when he passed away, he made a comment on your book, and he said, "The contemplative and self-reflective reader who seeks to grasp the full measure of this rich manuscript can expect to gain substantially in both knowledge and inner maturation." And so I think he's right on, and that is, sometimes we aren't even aware that we're suffering from this. And as you said, it's a current that runs in all of us, and so maybe to a greater or lesser extent, but I think that there's something so valuable about starting to look at all of those grains of sand that are on whatever beach we happen to be standing on, and to start understanding that there needs to be some kind of repertory work that can be done to just make us more whole and to initiate a healing process that all of us need to undergo. It's interesting because you mentioned politicians early on when you were kind of giving examples of people that often suffer from this kind of narcissism. And I mean, right now, you know, because we're in an election year, it's very significant to look at some of the things that are going on. And I don't suppose we have much time to get into it here, but if you read the book and you start looking at the politicians as an example, not to stereotype them, but certainly we have seen in the course of the election campaign so far examples of this, and I suspect that we will continue to see that. And your examples of the way that men have split and end up using women is always something that seems to be kind of first and foremost.
Sure. Yeah, I was struck by how many women have written to me and come to me and talked to me after lectures, what have you, about how important someone writing about this stuff is for them, because so many women are often drawn to the puer, to the charismatic type of narcissistic male, that they're seductive. You know, they can be very seductive. And the good-hearted women that want to give and are generous and nurturing and all that, and they often are the ones that are harmed very mightily by these types of relationships. And sometimes they'll just repeat the patterns again and again. So it's been helpful for women who have been able to learn about the patterns in themselves and what is it that draws them to that type of man. Well, maybe they don't want the harsh, more phallic male that's more dominant and all that. They prefer the softer male, but then they end up getting mistreated in different kinds of ways. So I've been struck by how many women have found themselves in some of these stories and vignettes throughout the book, as well as in the historical pictures and the myths and the legends and the films and so forth. So it's been very rich for both men and women.
Well, I can see how that would be true, and of course we're talking about romantic relationships for the most part, and definitely emotional relationships. What about the women who also carry, I mean all of us, women or men carry that narcissism. What about the women who really struggle with this in their lives? I have known a number of people who particularly have spoken of their mothers as being very narcissistic, and it seems like that could be equally damaging, if not more so, for the children that are in their care.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that's very, very true. And I think that the narcissistic parents, there can be sort of an intergenerational process that gets handed down. I think that Alice Miller, The Drama of the Gifted Child, many, many years ago wrote about that, particularly the mother and the father's influence on the children, kind of forcing them into roles, say a mother that kind of needs the child to depend on them in such a way so that the children end up developing patterns of having to take care of the narcissistic mother. And that's how they get loved secondarily. And so I think that there's a lot of rich material around that issue, on mothers and sons and mothers and daughters. And, of course, you find the narcissistic father who's so self-absorbed and busy and not giving the daughter nurturance, and the Kohut sense, that mirroring where he sees her and he sees her specialness, that she's his special child, and she can kind of internalize that and feel that love internally and internalize that kind of mirroring for herself. There's many men that don't have that in them to do that, and the daughters suffer. But, as I've said before, my study has been more with men, and there are many other studies and writers that I would defer to as far as the women's struggle with narcissism.
Well, I just think that, the topic itself is so profound when we actually start taking a look at it. And I'm certain that the book itself, Eros and the Shattering Gaze, Transcending Narcissism, is going to be a wonderful topic for the month of April for the Depth Psychology Online Book Club. Ken, this has just been so enlightening, and I'm so looking forward to the discussion in April online, and I just can't wait to dig more into the topic and to find out more about how understanding all of this can help all of us in a very, very profound way. Just in closing here, is there anything that you'd like to read from the book to send us out?
Actually, yes. I have a favorite passage. It's about 4 paragraphs, but I think it's worthwhile. It's in the last chapter of the book, which is called The Capacity to Love. Nietzsche describes the Apollonian man building an elaborate sandcastle on the shore at low tide. He imagines himself to be timeless, and therefore believes that his work of art will last forever as well. In the eternal moment of his illusion, he cannot conceive of anything contrary. Oblivious to the inevitable reality of the oncoming tide, he is devastated and shocked when his creation is demolished by the waves. The Dionysian man, on the contrary, never puts a shovel to the sand because he knows all too well what is coming. As Stephen Mitchell writes, he knowingly stands back beyond the high water mark, secretly tyrannized and depleted by reality. He is overly aware of his life's impermanence and could not justify the work entailed in building something unless he could be absolutely certain that his creation would last for an eternity. He doesn't suffer fools lightly, and therefore holds no illusions about things lasting forever. Nietzsche's tragic man, who stands poised between the Apollonian man and the Dionysian man, observes the tides and knows full well the transitory nature of his creation. He sets about to build his castle in the sand, despite the recognition that the pressing waters will one day wash away everything he has made. In Mitchell's words, the inevitable limitations of reality do not dim the passion in which he builds his castles. In fact, the inexorable realities add a poignancy and sweetness to his passion. This, Nietzsche suggests, is the richest form of life. End quote. We may courageously commit ourselves to loving another, fully and without restraint. ever knowing that eventually that person will leave us in death or in some other devastating way. But not today, and probably not tomorrow. We will face that inevitable disappointment, bear it, even mourn it, as deeply as we love. But the disappointments we are prepared to confront will not dim the fires that inspire and transform us in love today. The building of our sand castles on the shore is undertaken with the full knowledge that the tides of time and the vicissitudes of life will cover the shoreline and take away all we have built. The resilient man, whom Nietzsche calls the tragic man, knows this, yet does not turn away from the endeavor, despite the costs.
That's beautiful. Wow, the metaphor and the imagery that go with the sandcastles and the vast associations and understandings that are implied by that image are so powerful, and I thank you so much for sharing that with us. Again, you can find out more about the online book club on Deaf Psychology Alliance for the month of April with Ken Kimmel and his book, Eros and the Shattering Gaze, Transcending Narcissism. You can find more on depthinsights.com. That's DEPTHINSIGHTS.com. This is the media arm for Deaf Psychology Alliance, and it's where all of the information is. And then when you're ready to join the online book club, you can go to deafpsychologyalliance.com. And that is for members only, but it is absolutely free to join. And we have a growing dynamic community of over 1,200 people now, and there's something going on every single day. And I invite everybody to come join us. And, of course, if you've enjoyed what Ken has shared with us today, you can find more about Ken and the book at his website at kenkimmel.com, and that's KenKimmel.com. Ken, thank you so much for being with me today. I really look forward to sharing more with you in the book club in April.
Thank you so much, Bonnie.